Good morning, everyone. We have our participants, at least 132 participants already, but we had nearly 350, I think 350 as of this morning, who registered for our seminar. Allow us to start. Again, officially, good morning to everyone and good evening to some colleagues beyond the other side of the world. And welcome to Stratbase ADR Institute's Foreign Policy Forum that will focus on 70 years of the 1951 Philippine-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty, opportunities and challenges in the changing 21st century Indo-Pacific region. I'd like to take this opportunity to open our forum and thank our partners for this morning: the United States Embassy, the Department of National Defense College of the Philippines. Just a week ago, I wrote in my regular commentary how we need to shape, or in my Stratbase brief a few months back, how do we need to shape the future of the West Philippine Sea and forge alliances in this multipolar Indo-Pacific. The idea of the government enhancing its strategic operation with partners and allies, including the United States, where we can create a comprehensive foreign policy and national security strategy. And since then, we have seen how even the visit and the meeting between the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and our own Defense Secretary, Department of National Defense Secretary Lawrence Sana. I'd like to quote a strong statement coming from U.S. Defense Secretary: the Philippines is a vital treaty ally, and how America is committed to a sovereign and secure Philippines, and hope to build a stronger alliance based on our foundation of common interests and common values. That triggered the commentary that I wrote just last week with the Philippine Daily Inquirer, where I spoke of the need to stay focused on further consolidation of the U.S.-Philippine alliance. There's also a need to revisit the terms of the Mutual Defense Treaty and other agreements with its allies and partners, especially since the current regional security context has become more dynamic and complicated. And we build this argument on studies that we continue to do once or twice in a year in our institute in partnership with the Social Weather Station. The United States continued to be the most trusted country by Filipinos across geographic and demographic breakdowns. We have seen how in our study last June, the Philippine government is actually being encouraged by 70% of Filipinos to form alliances with other countries so we can best defend the Philippines' territorial and economic rights in the West Philippine Sea. And some of these measures that we saw in our study last June was, how can the Philippines strengthen our own military capability? It's about also conducting joint maritime patrols and military exercise with allied countries. And Filipinos, at least 57% of them, 63% in Metro Manila, would like us to fully implement the terms of the Visiting Forces Agreement and the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, both with the United States. That's why when I was asked to write a commentary on the eve of the President's last State of the Nation address, I remember pointing this out, that the future of the Indo-Pacific will depend on the multilateral understanding and cooperation between like-minded states. We need the Philippines to calibrate its position on China and build a stronger and more responsive foreign and security policy. And key to that is prioritizing multilateralism and strategic partnership. And just this past few weeks, we saw the introduction of AUKUS, or the Australia, United Kingdom, and United States trilateral security partnership. We have seen just a week ago also the joint statement of the Quad leaders. I remember we did in our institute with Dr. Renato Castro a study on Quad, and nobody really took us seriously 2.5 years back. Here we are now, that you see neighbors in Asia, Japan, the Indo-Pacific, Australia, India, and the United States, having a strong statement. And that's why when I ended my commentary last week, as we look into the elections, we all know that by tomorrow, candidates will be filing their candidacy in the Philippines. The Philippines has an opportunity to rethink its national security strategy and build better from the foreign policy initiatives of President Duterte. I have this hope that the next administration will also have a chance to renew its commitment with trusted traditional allies, such as the United States. Again, as I open and welcome our participants, I remain thankful for our partnership. So allow me to share and transfer literally the microphone to our partner from the National Defense College, Dr. Jose Santos Caranda.
To the Secretary of National Defense, Secretary Delphine and Lorenzana, to the President of the National Defense College of the Philippines, Professor Dr. Archimedes H. Viaje, MNSA, to the Chairperson of Stratbase ADR Institute, Ambassador Albert Del Rosario, to the President of Stratbase ADR Institute, Professor Victor Andres Dindo Manit, to the Charge d'Affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Manila, Ms. Heather Garriava, to the Ambassador of the Philippines to the U.S., Ambassador Jose Manuel Babe Romaldes, the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Ambassador Jennifer Galt, the Chair and Charles H. Stockton Professor of International Maritime Law, Dr. James Kraska, Professor of Politics and Director of Asian Studies of the Catholic University of America, Dr. Andrew Yo, Trustee and Program Convener of Stratbase ADR Institute and a member of the NDCP Academic Board, Professor Dr. Renato de Castro, Director of the UP Institute of Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea, Dr. J Batumbaka, Associate Professor at the International Studies Department of De La Salle University and our moderator for this event, Dr. Charmaine Misalucha Willoughby, NDCP officials, faculty and staff, our dear NDCP alumni, our friends and partners at the Stratbase ADR Institute and the U.S. Embassy in Manila. Good morning to all. We are pleased and honored to deliver the welcome remarks in today's event entitled 70 Years of the 1951 Philippine-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty, MDT. Opportunities and challenges in a changing 21st century Indo-Pacific region. This event, which is an example of the strong partnership involving the Stratbase ADR Institute for Strategic and International Studies, ADRi, the United States of America Embassy in Manila, and our National Defense College of the Philippines mirrors the robust partnership between the Republic of the Philippines and the United States of America. As the world adjusts to the turbulence in global politics brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, our government remains committed to working with our allies and strategic partners to ensure peace and stability in the region. The Mutual Defense Treaty, MDT, is the only alliance maintained by the Philippines, which makes it the country's most robust, multifaceted, and complex defense and security partnership to date. Since 1951, the alliance between the Philippines and the United States has faced several challenges and difficulties. Among these issues include the termination of the bases agreement, the legal debates on the Visiting Forces Agreement, and the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, and the durability and relevance of the MDT. The dynamic and open discussions on these matters reflect a vibrant public discourse and interest that encourages both governments in Washington and in Manila to work harder in keeping the alliance and ensuring it benefits both countries. More importantly, the existence of the MDT and subsequent defense and military agreements demonstrate a shared worldview and a mental model of our people and governments. Although they seem to be incongruent at times, the foundations remain the same: democracy, rule of law, cooperation, peaceful resolution of conflict, and trust are among the pillars that makes the Philippines and the United States of America natural partners. As changes in the Indo-Pacific region are surfacing, the words of former U.S. Secretary of State Michael Pompeo still reverberates in the halls of the national security establishments in Manila. And I quote, "As the South China Sea is part of the Pacific, any armed attack on Philippine forces, aircraft, or public vessels in the South China Sea would trigger mutual defense obligations under Article 4 of our Mutual Defense Treaty." While the U.S. holds up to its obligations, the Philippines is also called to do the same. As partners, Manila has duties and responsibilities to ensure that it contributes to the strength of the alliance. Through education and knowledge generation, the National Defense College of the Philippines and think tanks and private research institutes have the opportunity to contribute to improving the alliance. We are accorded with creative deviance to find transformative mental models, generate innovative solutions, and promote ideas towards peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. We hope that today's event contributes to that end and that we can boost the discussion forward. So again, welcome to this conference on the MDT, and we look forward to the meaningful and engaging discussion ahead. Mabuhay po ang Pilipinas, mabuhay po tayong lahat.
Thank you, Dean Karandang. Allow me to introduce our speaker to deliver the keynote address. Secretary Delphine Lorenzana, Secretary of the Department of National Defense, who pre-recorded his remarks because he is on standby for the final approval of the 2022 national budget.
Ambassador Jose Manuel Romualdez, U.S. Embassy Chargé d'Affaires Heather Variaba, former DFA Secretary and Ambassador Albert Del Rosario, Dr. Jose Santos Carandang, Professor Dindo Manhit, esteemed speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank Stratbase ADR Institute, the U.S. Embassy, and the National Defense College of the Philippines for organizing this forum and for inviting me to give the keynote speech. My speech today will be brief. First, I will give a short history of the MDT in the past 70 years of its existence. Second, I will discuss from my perspective the current situations obtaining in the Indo-Pacific region, and lastly, some thoughts on the ways forward. It is my hope that the invited speakers who are experts in their fields can elucidate and discuss further the points raised and offer suggestions or courses of action with the aim of improving the security and stability of the region. The MDT. On August 30, 1951, President Elpidio Quirino delivered his remarks after the signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty in Washington, D.C., where he paradoxically described it as the end and the beginning. While he did not elaborate what he meant by that strange statement, he must have been alluding to the end of an era where the Philippines was totally dependent on the U.S. for its security, to an era when the Philippines is sufficiently developed militarily to stand on its own 2 feet. It did not happen. There were 2 salient points of the MDT. First, that both countries will aid the other in case of external attack, and second, that through self-help and mutual assistance improve the defense capabilities. For the second point, President Quirino must have hoped that the U.S., being the major partner and the only superpower at that time, would help the Philippines because when the MDT was signed, the Philippines was still reeling from the effects of World War II. The Philippines was slowly trying to revive its ravaged economy and infrastructures. Manila was the most devastated city next to Warsaw. During these times, the Philippines was not in any position to buy military equipment. Its only hope was assistance from its ally, the United States of America. As the U.S. military drew down their forces in the region, the Philippines became the biggest beneficiary of their excess defense articles such as ships, planes, trucks, artillery, and other war material. This became the norm in the succeeding years. That is, the Philippines received mostly hand-me-downs, never brand new equipment. This is still the case up to this day. We may be the only country that still have World War II era ships in its inventory. The presence of the U.S. bases in the Philippines that provided a security umbrella may have lulled the Philippines into a false sense of security. The inadequacy of the Philippine defense capability was exposed when the U.S. bases were closed in 1992. With the closure of the U.S. bases, the supply of spare parts to maintain equipment ran dry, and a huge number of ships, planes, helicopters, and trucks became inoperational. With its decrepit navy, it is clear that it could not protect its vast maritime domain. It is no coincidence that the Chinese wrestled control of Mischief Reef in 1995, 3 years after the bases were closed. The 70 years of the MDT was remarkable not for what happened, but for what did not happen. First, no foreign power attacked any one of the parties. Not that we would have wanted this to happen, but quite the contrary, we were happy that it did not. Second, one of the provisions of the treaty is for mutual assistance to improve the other's military capability. This too did not happen, as earlier pointed out. Until recently, there were nagging questions in the minds of Filipinos, especially for those who are watching the evolving security environment in the region. Four questions that are playing in their minds, including my own, are: is the MDT still relevant after 70 years? Is it time to abrogate it? Is it time to replace it with a new one that is more responsive to the times? Or revise it? Initial discussions have been made between officials of both militaries to achieve some consensus how to move forward. The security environment in the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific region is currently relatively peaceful, but beneath this calm surface are issues between and among nations that, if not managed properly, would ignite open hostilities. First is the age-old territorial disputes. Everybody here is familiar with the disputes in the Senkaku Islands between China and Japan, the South China Sea among four nations of ASEAN and China, the Sabah issue between the Philippines and Malaysia, and the boundary dispute between India and China. Second is the existence of homegrown terrorists. Not only do these terrorists have easy access to and from other neighboring countries, but often they are aided by imported terrorists. We consider terrorism as a major security threat because more than any other country in the region, the Philippines perhaps has suffered the most from terrorist attacks, the most recent of which was the suicide bombing of the Holo Cathedral in January 2019. Third is China's long dream of unification with Taiwan. This has a potential to create a major conflagration due to the possible involvement of the United States. Fourth is the nuclear-armed North Korea, which continues to be a great concern by South Korea, Japan, and the region as a whole. Fifth is the proliferation of drugs. No country in the region is free of this scourge. Drugs respect no boundaries. Sixth is the exploitation of resources like underwater hydrocarbons and water resources. An example is the drilling of oil in the South China Sea and the use of the Mekong River, which passes through 5 Asian nations. The headwater of this river is in China. Seventh are transnational crimes like trafficking of people, especially women and children, also the illegal sales of weapons and ammunition. Eighth, automation. With the breakneck speed of technological advances, it was reported by the World Bank that about 50 million people in Southeast Asia will lose their jobs to machines in the next decade. Lastly, the effect of climate change. Rising sea level was reported to displace millions of people now living in small islands and low-lying coastal areas. There are many other issues and concerns, but these are the major ones that could cause a lot of problems for all concerned. Ways forward. This mix of issues and challenges is beyond the capacity of one nation to solve. It needs a multilateral approach. Most of these problems were non-existent when the MDT was signed in 1951. The whole of Southeast Asia was then watching the march of communism and the ensuing conflict it would bring if it reached their lands. Having said all this, I go back to my previous questions. Is the MDT still relevant, or should it be abrogated, replaced, or revised? These questions are tricky as it has implications to the security of both parties and individually. Some have posited that a treaty with some vagueness can give the parties some elbow room to maneuver. However, that can also be a recipe for miscalculations and accidental encounters that could ignite a war. While the U.S. welcomes the idea of revisiting the MDT, an outside party does not. When I first broached the idea of revisiting the MDT, the former Chinese ambassador came to me and said, "Please do not touch the MDT, leave it as it is." But the more important question is, how does the MDT fit in with the current situation in the region? The USA has bilateral arrangements with ASEAN countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and to some extent with Taiwan. Are bilateral agreements better than multilateral? Is it time to create a NATO-like arrangements, not to prepare for war, but to address the concerns previously enumerated? How does the newly formed alliance, the AUKUS, fit into the large picture? Will it contribute to peace and stability or exacerbate current problems? On the micro level, each of the smaller countries will have to find ways to manage the relationship with the neighboring giant, China, inasmuch as it has disputes with most of the nations in the region. How will the disputes in the South China Sea play out? What is the end game? President Xi Jinping, during his last bilateral meeting with President Duterte, said these words after the latter invoked the arbitral ruling. And I quote, "Mr. President, we also claim the area. I do not think we will resolve this issue in our lifetime. Maybe our children and our grandchildren will have better solutions." Unquote. These words speak volumes of the overall strategy of China in the South China Sea. There are many proposals brought forward, such as joint management of the area, joint development of its resources, and turning it into a global commons, among others. But one thing is clear, the Chinese, having embedded themselves with their artificial islands, are not in a hurry for any resolution that is not in its favor. So how do other nations deal with this strategy? China likewise is adept at gaming the system. For instance, it knew that any aggression it takes will trigger the MDT. So what it did was to employ what is called the raison tactics, using maritime militias in asserting its so-called historical claims, and cabbage tactics, that is, to overwhelm and seize control of an island by surrounding and wrapping it in successive layers of ships. This reminds us of the Whitson Reef incident earlier this year, where 220 ships are in one area. How do claimants deal with this tactic? Is the U.S. and other nations' freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, effective in stopping China from pursuing its designs in the South China Sea? One suggestion that has been put on the table is to revise the MDT to address all or most of the concerns enumerated above. After all, with the ongoing dialogue between and among nations, the likelihood of a shooting war is remote, as every nation involved will suffer dire consequences. There will be no victors in the next war, only losers. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in very interesting times. There were challenges facing us, but there were also opportunities to build consensus within our reach that will benefit everyone in the region. The pandemic that is currently ravaging the world is, in a sense, a blessing in disguise. It has taught us to slow down and to learn to work together again to achieve a common objective. If all of us can fight the COVID-19 virus as one, we can also rise above ourselves and our petty national interest for the benefit of the whole region and the whole world. Thank you and good day.
Thank you for that keynote address from the Secretary of the Department of National Defense, Secretary Delphine Lorenzana. Allow me to introduce, to deliver a message, Ms. Heather Variaba, Charge d'Affaires ad interim of the U.S. Embassy in Manila. She's a member of the Senior Foreign Service class of Minister Counselors. Ms. Heather?
Good morning. Thank you so much, Professor Dindo. And I'd really like to thank our co-hosts, Stratbase ADR, Professor Dindo Manhit, Ambassador Albert Del Rosario, also our National Defense College colleagues, Dr. Jose Santos Carandang. It is really a pleasure to be with you here today. I feel quite honored to be amongst such a distinguished group of experts and leaders. Of course, Secretary Lorenzana, who gave his very interesting remarks, and we had a great first meeting yesterday, as well as Ambassador Romualdez, Philippine ambassador to the United States, and my colleague Ambassador Jennifer Galt, who is our senior foreign policy advisor to the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, as well as many other experts on the line that I can see. I'm newly arrived in the Philippines, and so I have a lot to learn, and I feel very honored to be a part of such a distinguished group. I've been here about a month, and even though it's only been 1 month, I'm already feeling so warmly welcomed by the Filipino people, by the government, by all of our friends and colleagues here. Secretary Lorenzana mentioned the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic and how we all need to work together. It's really an important time to be working together, and the United States continues to support the Philippines' fight against COVID-19. We've facilitated the donation of more than 16 million vaccine doses to the Philippines through COVAX, including more than 9 million of direct donations and 7.1 million doses purchased with COVAX funds. The United States is by far the biggest contributor to the COVAX facility. In total, the Philippines will receive 44 million COVID-19 vaccine doses through COVAX. In addition to the vaccines we're providing directly to the Philippines, we also have providing it to other nations in the region, to our ASEAN friends and colleagues, close to 30 million doses. I had the privilege of joining Secretary Carlito Galvez at a recent vaccine delivery here in Manila, and it was very heartening to see the life-saving shipments coming, with the knowledge that more are on the way. In fact, I have colleagues from the embassy who are at the airport now, this morning, receiving more doses, and we have more coming in the next few days and weeks. So we're really committed to working with the Philippines together to fight the pandemic. In addition to vaccine, the United States has provided more than $39 million, or 1.9 billion Philippine pesos, in COVID-related assistance to the Philippines. These donations include 420 ICU beds, 100 new ventilators, and millions of pesos worth of PPE. So we continue to partner and support the Philippines in this fight. For decades, the United States and the Philippines have supported one another in time of need. We've faced seemingly insurmountable challenges, but together we prevail. And I think that our work in facing the pandemic is a good example of that. Our alliance was forged by the shared sacrifice of Americans and Filipinos in World War II, and it has grown into a lasting friendship and partnership that goes well beyond mutual defense. The Philippines remains a vital treaty ally to the United States, our oldest treaty ally in the region, and most importantly, an equal and sovereign partner. Our alliance is foundational to the U.S. role in the Indo-Pacific. It is a relationship built on shared strategic interests, shared history, shared culture, shared values of democracy, protection of human rights, and other key values. And at the center of our relationship and our alliance is our peoples. Our Mutual Defense Treaty, 70 years old this year, enshrines our shared security commitment to address challenges together, including in the West Philippine Sea. Those whose actions or pronouncements fly in the face of international law should know that the United States and the Philippines stand together, shoulder to shoulder. In that regard, we strongly welcomed President Duterte's decision to restore the Visiting Forces Agreement during Secretary of Defense Austin's visit in July. The joint activities enabled by the VFA strengthen not just the security of our two nations, but also the rules-based order that benefits all nations in the Indo-Pacific. The VFA provides the framework allowing our Department of Defense to conduct more than 300 bilateral engagements a year with the armed forces of the Philippines, from expert exchanges to ship visits to component exercises and major training exercises such as Balikatan, which was held this past April, and exercise MTA Sama Sama, which is scheduled for this fall. Under the auspices of the Alliance and the Mutual Defense Treaty, the U.S. has been providing support and assistance to this country for many years, and partnered with many governments and peoples here in the Philippines. Secretary Lorenzana outlined a host of issues that we must work together on. And I was very interested to see some of the figures that Professor Dindo highlighted in terms of what the people of the Philippines want in terms of building capacity of the military and the Coast Guard, and partnering with the United States and others. And our defense treaty and our activities really get at some of those things. And so it's a shared interest and objectives that we have. This year, the United States and the Philippines celebrate the 75th anniversary of our bilateral diplomatic relationship. We are indeed thriving at 75, and we are thrilled with the continued partnership between our two countries spanning so many decades. And we look forward to many more decades to come as friends, partners, and allies. Thank you very much for letting me join you this morning. I look forward to hearing from all the experts. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Ms. Heather, and welcome to the Philippines. Allow me to introduce a colleague, Dr. Charmaine, Ms. Lucia Willoughby, who will be taking over hosting our forum and moderating our discussion. Dr. Charmaine.
Thank you so much, sir, and good morning to everybody. We have a distinguished panel, actually two panels, who are, and the members of the panels will be speaking about something that would be very, very close to our hearts and to our interests. Each panelist will be given around 10 minutes to deliver his or her remarks, after which we will proceed with our Q&A later on. So to begin the first panel, we are honored to have with us today Ambassador Jose Manuel Bay Romualdez, the Philippine Ambassador to the United States, to speak about how we can move the alliance forward. Sir, the virtual floor is now yours.
My partner and friend, Ambassador Albert de Rosario, very nice to see you. And of course, Professor Dindo Manhit, and Professor Renato Castro. And let me also greet CDA Heather Variaba. I've never had the pleasure of meeting you in person, but it's very good to see you, virtually at least, and meeting you virtually. Let me extend my gratitude to the Stratbase ADR Institute in partnership with the U.S. Embassy in Manila and the National Defense College of the Philippines for organizing this virtual international conference on the 70 years of the Mutual Defense Treaty. It has been a flurry of commemorative activities and high-level meetings for us here in Washington, D.C. since the start of the year, given the two milestones we're celebrating in 2021, the 75th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between our two countries, and of course, the 70th year of the 70th anniversary of the signing of the MDT. When we launched the anniversary logo last June, I think, of this year, commemorating 75 years of relations between our two countries this year, we had in fact did jointly with the United States, our message was loud and clear. We are celebrating these milestones, not just to take stock of what we have achieved together over the last 7 decades, but also look at how we can make the relationship even stronger, more relevant, and beneficial to our peoples, as well as expansive or responsive to the ever-evolving challenges today and in the future. As a matter of fact, Secretary Locsin is here now in Washington, D.C., and had several meetings with our friends in the U.S. Congress, starting with Senator Risch of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee. And we were very pleased that he was very pleased that our relationship with the United States remains strong and that the VFA has been restored. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has surely brought to the fore the continued relevance of the Philippines-U.S. relationship, with both our countries helping each other to save lives through the supply of much-needed vaccines. The Philippines has thus far received something like 16 million doses to the COVAX facility, of which more than 9 million were donated directly by the United States. I was very pleased. I was just told by our friend at the White House that the United States is giving us another additional 5.3 billion doses of Pfizer doses. So that is very good news indeed, and we are grateful to the United States for this kind of help that they're giving us. Following the recent meetings between Foreign Affairs Secretary Teodoro Locsin and USAID Administrator Samantha Power, the Philippines will also receive an additional 11.3 million in COVID-19 response financing, bringing the total of U.S. financial assistance to over 39 million. Without a doubt, the U.S. has been a reliable partner for us throughout this pandemic, with President Rodrigo Roa Duterte himself extending his gratitude to the Biden administration for giving us a hand during these very trying times. While we are still battling this pandemic, let us not forget that there is more work to be done to ensure that no virus will once again bring the world down to its knees. We continue to look at the United States to take the lead in rallying the international community towards a pandemic-free world, and we stand ready to do our part in partnership with the community of nations to achieve this objective. Time and again, this relationship has proven its relevance and importance amidst the numerous challenges that we all face, and we have to cooperate on the disaster relief and recovery, in countering terrorism, and to the economic development and fostering our people-to-people ties and exchanges. However, with the pandemic magnifying great power dynamics, particularly in our own backyard, all eyes have been on our decades-old security alliance with the United States and how effective it will be in maintaining peace and security in the region. In late July, President Duterte decided to terminate the abrogation of the Visiting Forces Agreement, cognizant of the rising tensions and geopolitical developments in the South China Sea, which many political observers and analysts refer to as the new theater for superpower rivalry. Both sides worked hard to get the VFA back on track, and I believe that there is no better time to breathe new life into this agreement than during our milestone anniversaries. Meanwhile, as the Mutual Defense Treaty turned 70 in August, questions remain as its possible applicability should conflict erupt in the South China Sea. To this, the United States has reaffirmed in no uncertain terms that it has done several times before that an armed attack on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the South China Sea would invoke the U.S. mutual defense commitments under Article 4 of the 1951 U.S. Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. As we are all aware, and fortunately, the treaty has not been invoked given the absence of an external attack against both parties over the last 7 decades. In fact, both countries must be lauded for fulfilling their commitment under Article 1, which is to settle any international disputes in which they may be involved by peaceful means in such a manner that the international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Indeed, Philippine foreign policy under President Duterte has aimed towards just that, the resolution of disputes through peaceful means and the prevention of conflict. Let me stress, however, that not having the condition for its applicability does not render the treaty irrelevant. Neither does the continued absence of conflict mean that the Philippines can bide its time in beefing up its own defense capabilities, as well as provided for under Article 2. Undoubtedly, the world has markedly changed since 1951. Security threats have since evolved, and there are new realities that need to be considered for the treaty to be effective in ensuring the security of both the Philippines and the United States. Indeed, the two in-person meetings between Defense Secretary Lorenzana and U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin last July and earlier this month here in Washington have been very productive and touching on the need to make the MDT more attuned to the times, consistent with the treaty's Article 3 on the consultations. In closing, since the Biden administration assumed office, the Philippines has been asked many times by the United States, what can we do for you? As with many others struggling to manage this pandemic and at the same time keeping their economies afloat, we do need help now more than ever. But one thing is imperative. We need to make the alliance and the relationship between our two countries truly effective and functional for the mutual security of our nations and our peoples. This starts with the recognition that at 75 and 70, our ties and alliance respectively will need a refresh, so to speak. As I've said, it is imperative for anything that old to evolve if it is to keep up with the times. In fact, the Philippines has proposed a multi-year plan that will ensure continuity and predictability in our efforts to modernize our military and defense capabilities. We hope to sit down with our U.S. counterparts to thresh out the details of this proposed program. Finally, to the United States, we say a stronger Philippines, both militarily and economically, can do a lot more for the United States than one that continues to be weak and unable to support itself. There is anyway the word mutual in the MDT, and it is high time that that treaty lives up to its name. We have to mutually be able to defend each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And indeed, there are a lot of things that we need to do to ensure that the alliance continues and remains robust in the face of the many challenges that we are facing. So from a discussion on how to move the alliance forward, we will now turn to the importance and the critical role that multilateralism plays. And here we will listen to Ambassador Jennifer Galt, who is the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Ambassador Galt, please. Oh, you're on mute, ma'am.
Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Living in the virtual world, there are too many buttons to push. Apologies for that. Thank you to Secretary Lorenzana, Ambassador Romualdez, U.S. Chargé d'Affaires Variava, Stratbase for inviting me to join this distinguished event today. I wish you a warm aloha from U.S. Indo-Pacific. This meeting is very timely as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the U.S. and Philippine Diplomatic Relations and the 70th anniversary of the Philippine-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty. This is an important moment for us to look forward and to think of the next steps that we will take together as sovereign and equal partners to move our alliance into a new phase to respond to the current security environment. In the past 3 months, as has been described, there's been a flurry of senior government leader engagements in Manila and in Washington, D.C. to pave the way forward with our alliance on both the diplomatic and security fronts. In July, U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin visited Manila and met with Philippine President Duterte, Secretary Lorenzana, and Secretary Lacson. In August, U.S. Indo-PACOM Commander Aquilino visited Manila and met with Secretary of Defense Lorenzana, Secretary Lacson, and Armed Forces of the Philippines leadership. Then in September, Philippine Secretary of Defense Lorenzana and Secretary of Foreign Affairs Lacson were in Washington, D.C., and met with their counterparts, U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin and Secretary of State Blinken. I was pleased to accompany U.S. Indo-PACOM Commander Aquilino on his August visit to the Philippines and look forward to our return visit next month for our annual military talks. These visits exemplify the importance of our alliance and our mutual commitment to further strengthen our partnership. It is important to acknowledge the role the U.S.-Philippine alliance plays as an anchor of our security network in Southeast Asia and in the broader Indo-Pacific region. The people of our two countries have shared a deep friendship that is based on a common set of values and principles. This was the basis for the foundation of our alliance 70 years ago and is enduring today. True friendship equates to trust, and this trust is necessary to confront the security challenges in the Indo-Pacific region today. By strengthening collaboration and increasing the scope of our engagements, we will further grow our bond and ensure its lasting impact. Together, we present an integrated deterrence posture to any adversary, making them pause before they take any action that threatens a free, safe, prosperous, and open Indo-Pacific. From rejecting an open Indo-Pacific enabled by the rules-based international order. From rejecting unlawful maritime claims in the South China Sea to countering malign influences throughout the region, the strength of our alliance, apologies, I've lost my spot here. Hold on just a sec. The strength of our alliance is what will ensure our continued success in these endeavors. Both of our nations have made it clear that we are committed to our alliance and that we remain prepared to fight alongside and defend each other using all of our capabilities to preserve the region's peace and stability. Our ways of life, our economies, and the livelihoods of our families depend on this commitment. The U.S. alliance with the Philippines is anchored not just in our security relationship, but in the deep and abiding people-to-people ties, close economic connections, and commitment to combating climate change. Our people-to-people ties are at the foundation of our alliance. We have 30,000 U.S. veterans and 350,000 U.S. citizens who live in the Philippines. There are 4 million Filipino Americans in the United States, many here in Hawaii. More than 350 Filipinos and Americans participate each year in exchanges sponsored by the United States government. This year, as we commemorate 70 years of the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty, 2021 also marks the 70th anniversary of the Fulbright Philippines Educational Program, the oldest continuously running Fulbright program anywhere in the world. In terms of our economic ties, there are about 3.4 billion US dollars in trade that move through Southeast Asia. And in the Philippines alone, US FDI totaled 161.6 million last year. A huge priority for the Biden administration is climate change. The Philippines, like much of Southeast Asia, has large population centers in low-lying coastal areas. When we look at countries that we'd like to partner with on climate change and how we build greater resilience and sustainability in the future, the Philippines is a key part of that equation. The Mutual Defense Treaty formally enshrines our alliance with language that affords our respective national authorities flexibility in responding to threats. Under the MDT, the Mutual Defense Con Plan, regularly updated and signed by the Indo-PACOM Commander and the AFP Chief of Staff, reflects our agreed operational approaches to address the range of challenges we might face. The MDT provides the foundation for our defense relationship, and it enables the United States and the Philippines to partner on shared military objectives, along with newer agreements. The Visiting Forces Agreement is absolutely vital to the activities we undertake together. We were very pleased that President Duterte made the decision to fully restore the VFA. The MDT, VFA, and the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement collectively enable deep and wide-ranging defense cooperation between our two countries. President Biden and Secretary Austin have been abundantly clear about how we view our MDT responsibilities. We believe and affirm that an armed attack on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific, including the South China Sea, will trigger U.S. obligations under the MDT, and we fully intend to stand by these obligations. The United States and the Philippines conduct over 300 defense engagements annually. Our armed forces are engaging with each other constantly, routinely, and have habits of cooperation that we can apply to any number of challenges. We also recognize that the security environment is changing. It is becoming more complex, and we need to think about how to posture our alliance for that reality and for the future. What we are seeing across the region and in the South China Sea are persistent actions that create new threats to sovereignty and economic security. The United States is committed to working alongside the Philippines to ensure you have the necessary capabilities to defend your interests, and to ensure collectively that our alliance has the capability to address new threats and challenges in the security environment. This is one reason why we have deeply committed over the years to security cooperation and security assistance activities for our Philippine allies, working alongside you to ensure that we are supporting force modernization. We appreciate the efforts of Secretary Lorenzana and our Philippine partners to build capabilities for the future. With the restoration of the VFA and a range of high-level engagements that are ongoing, we are identifying concrete ways to move our alliance into the future. We're excited to work together over the next several months on a joint vision statement that will outline new priorities for the next phase of alliance cooperation. This anniversary provides an opportunity for the United States and the Philippines to reaffirm our commitment to even more robust ties, as well as our commitment to a relationship that remains highly relevant as the world faces new and emerging challenges. As we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the MDT, we are on a positive path forward, and the future of the alliance is bright. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I regret that my schedule does not allow me to stay for the question and answer portion, but I wish you a productive meeting for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Galt, for reminding us that the alliance really is just one in a vast network of the relationship between the United States and the Philippines. From this, we now move to our third speaker, who will speak about how we can advance the free and open Indo-Pacific. But before I introduce Dr. Kraska, I would like to remind our audience and the rest of the participants, if you have any questions that you would like to raise, please make sure to type in your questions in the Q&A box. And if possible, if you can address the question to any one of our speakers. Okay, so we will be collecting questions as we go along. Now, for our third speaker, Dr. James Kraska is the chairman and Charles H. Stockton Professor of International Maritime Law at the Stockton Center for International Law, the U.S. Naval War College. At the same time, he is visiting Professor of Law, John Harvey Gregory Lecturer on World Organization at the Harvard Law School. Sir, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, Professor Ms. Lucha Willoughby, for the kind introduction, and hello to colleagues, and thank you to Professor Manhit from Stratbase ADR Institute, Dr. Caradong from the Defense College of the Philippines, and also the sponsorship of the U.S. Embassy, Charge d'Affaires Variava, and also it's a pleasure to listen to Ambassador Galt from Indo-PACOM. It was also a special treat to hear the Honorable Secretary Lorenzana from DND and Ambassador Romualdez, Ambassador to the United States. So thank you very much for the opportunity to participate and hear the speakers. I will provide a few thoughts on the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and these are my personal views or suggestions for thinking about the concept. And what I will conclude is that this ought to be interpreted broadly rather than narrowly, and that we would all benefit by thinking of ways that we can build out our thinking on free and open Indo-Pacific. The concept really emerged from Japan and was actually codified by Japan. In 2007, Prime Minister Abe proposed that if Japan and India were to work together, that it would coalesce into a broader Asia that would be open and transparent and would allow the free movement of goods and capital and knowledge to flow freely. And in 2016, Japan first promoted for this concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. It was then adopted and incorporated in the U.S. Lexicon as well, where it remains. The Biden administration, in their interim national security guidance, talks about the context for a free and open Indo-Pacific, with China's neighbors being able to make decisions that are free of coercion. And the administration has adopted a holistic view that says that states ought to have freedom of action and that there should be a diversity of cultures and sovereignties in the region. The region is very important to the United States. We have almost $2 trillion in two-way trade between the Pacific region and the United States. And the United States, as a Pacific country, is connected to the Indo-Pacific region as well. The U.S. government is also invested in nurturing both bilaterally and multilateral institutions and facilitating private sector investments in the region in infrastructure, energy, the digital economy, strengthening civil society and democratic institutions, and countering the range of transnational threats, from terrorism to the rise of hegemonic powers, and of course, something we all face, climate change. And so the United States, in doing so, relies in particular on its relationship with allies. And this is a competitive advantage that the United States holds along collectively with our allies and partners around the world in facing the rise of autocratic states, the reemergence of Russia, and the potential risks or threats posed by China. In the Pacific region, the United States has close allies, of course, of the Philippines, as well as Thailand, Korea, Japan, and Australia, as well as a number of strategic partners, including Vietnam and India and other countries. And the U.S. has tried to work with this network of like-minded states that have a view of shared responsibility to uphold the values and the rules that underpin this free and open region. And in doing so, we've also reached out to institutions, including ASEAN, the Mekong states, and Pacific Island countries, as well as more recently, the importance of a strategic partnership with India. The Quad has been particularly important and growing in importance in realizing a free and open Indo-Pacific and in implementing the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. The first ministers meeting of the Quad was in 2019, and the second met in Tokyo in 2020. And it was in that meeting that the Quad exchanged views on the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and welcomed proactive efforts by states in the region, as well as those outside the region, as far as Europe, to implement and to recognize a free and open Indo-Pacific. And of course, France and the United Kingdom and other countries are invested in this concept as well. Of course, recently, over just the last week or two, has strengthened even further, and we've seen in the previous few years that, in particular, my view is that India and Australia are gravitating more toward a comprehensive view of a free and open Indo-Pacific, rather than considering it just a normative framing, but more of a concrete vision. And I suspect that this will continue because of the actions of China. For the past decade, China has constructed artificial islands on the Philippine continental shelf and has placed at risk, really in numerous ways, the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And some people, particularly in the media, have looked at this concept of free and open Indo-Pacific as simply another word for freedom of navigation. And what I suggest that while freedom of navigation and the right of overflight in international airspace beyond 12 miles certainly is important, it's necessary but insufficient alone to realize free and open Indo-Pacific. Freedom of navigation and overflight is simply one element of the full range of diplomatic, informational, military, and economic relationships and context in the region. And that's really where free and open Indo-Pacific is a strategy to be implemented. Freedom of navigation does relate to military security and also to economic prosperity for states in the region and for the United States. But I would suggest that we should think in the full sort of multi-dimensional nature of the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific and in bolstering deterrence. And this is something that's new that we haven't done very well, in my view, for the last 3 decades or so. During the Cold War, the United States and its alliance partners were quite sophisticated and thorough in thinking about deterrence. But that concept really has become considered by many to be just military deterrence, and a free and open Indo-Pacific requires us to broaden that concept and think through all elements of diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And I'll conclude with just a few of those areas that might be considered. China and Russia exploit free societies through what's termed the gray zone, where they combine proxy and paramilitary operations with election interference, political warfare, industrial espionage, economic mercantilism, protectionism, relentless cyber attacks. And this is where maintaining and protecting a free and open Indo-Pacific needs greater attention. There's already ample focus on the military aspect of this, but the resources and bilateral and multilateral cooperation on diplomatic, informational, and economic dimensions could benefit. For diplomatic issues, of course, the law of the sea and China's attempts to revise understandings of that. China also has attempted to renegotiate settled principles, not just through UNCLOS, but also in the US with the maritime military consultative agreements and the rules of behavior, where China has attempted to revise standards and rules that are pre-existing. I would suggest that it is in the process of trying to do this through the Code of Conduct process with ASEAN states and with the Philippines that degrades our accepted understanding and provides a entry point for greater Chinese interpretations that help to develop its hegemony in the region. For informational, we've seen everything from China's passport maps, including the South China Sea and Island Group, also in compelling companies in China to adhere to Chinese rules, for example, Twitter and Facebook, while these companies face or develop restrictions that apply outside of China. China's bolstering of its own image from movies such as Mulan or Shang-Chi, employment more insidiously of United Front activities, weaponized corruption in many countries, and payoffs, political payoffs, and employment of Confucius institutes. All of these are part of China's effective informational program that we are still trying to get a better handle of. And then finally, of course, with economic, that has received a little more attention. China has created a web of dependence, but we found with COVID and supply chains that the benefits tend to inure to China rather than be mutually beneficial. And so I think states have woken up to the problem that this poses, and it provides ample opportunity to be able to work together in order to provide alternatives. So in short, I would just suggest that rather than be narrowly focused on a free and open Indo-Pacific as a maritime concept, that we think more broadly about it, and that rather than think purely defensively and reactively, that we work together to be more proactive in developing relationships that provide a bulwark against influence from outside hegemonic states. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kraska, for highlighting that the success of the free and open Indo-Pacific idea and concept and strategy even, that its success depends a lot on the web of alliances and partnerships that are in the region. This also demonstrates to us the complementarity of the security cooperation mechanisms that we have available, and that everything is everything complements and is connected to each other. So from a discussion on the variety of security cooperation mechanisms, we now jump into our second panel, where we center on the importance of history. And our speaker for the second panel now, where we're moving to, is Dr. Andrew Yeo, who is Professor of Politics and Director of Asian Studies at the Catholic University of America. He is also the South Korea Foundation Chair of the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at Brookings. Andrew?
Thank you, Dr. Willoughby, and magandang umaga po. I'd like to congratulate Stratbase ADR and other sponsors of this event as we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Philippines-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty. Now, looking at the order of our second panel, I figured that my job was to provide some broad context to the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty, and that my two esteemed fellow panelists would go further in depth to address the current status and legal challenges to the Mutual Defense Treaty. And I know we're a little bit behind time, so I'm going to try to stick to the 10 minutes here. And I'm going to very briefly walk through the evolution of the San Francisco alliance system and address some of the challenges facing the US-led alliance system in the context of increasing US-China competition. My key argument is this: it's that the network of US bilateral alliances in Asia still form the core of the region's security architecture. While alliances should be continually renewed and transformed in the wake of shifting external and domestic circumstances, the complex patchwork of bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral institutional arrangements that have proliferated since the Cold War are in many ways still contingent on the existence of the San Francisco system. In other words, US bilateral alliances constitutes a core part of the present-day Asian security architecture, and they simply cannot be erased as a relic of the Cold War. The Philippines-US Mutual Defense Treaty is, of course, one piece of the larger San Francisco system that emerged from the San Francisco Peace Treaty signed on September 8, 1951, that formally ended hostilities with Japan, but also gave the US the legal right to maintain its military presence in Japan through a separate security treaty. More significantly, the San Francisco system established the post-World War II security architecture in East Asia. A week prior to the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, the United States had signed defense treaties with the Philippines and also Australia and New Zealand as part of the ANZUS Treaty to assuage any fears of Japanese rearmament and win regional support for a peace agreement with Japan. By 1954, South Korea and Taiwan would also sign defense treaties with the United States. In each of these countries, bilateralism offered the best antidote against Soviet expansionism and internal communist insurgencies. The adoption of bilateralism during the early Cold War years was heavily conditioned by the asymmetric nature of US power relative to other Asian states. The one significant US effort to establish multilateralism, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, suffered from legitimacy problems and remained weak, officially disbanding in 1977. Southeast Asians did make efforts towards regional cooperation in the 1960s, leading to the establishment of ASEAN in 1967. However, ASEAN would have little impact beyond the Southeast Asia sub-region until after the end of the Cold War. So when we get to the end of the Cold War, we do see this expansion of Asia's regional architecture. The collapse of the Cold War order didn't provide the shock which would produce sweeping changes to Asia's post-Cold War security arrangements. However, it did create a permissive environment for institutional experimentation. New questions pertaining to security emerged in the 1990s as policymakers discussed opportunities for greater multilateral security cooperation. Asian institutions continued to proliferate over the next 2 decades. In a region once described as severely under-institutionalized, the growth rate of Asian institutions outpaced that of most other regions. If US support for Asian institutions appeared tepid in the immediate post-Cold War period, the pivot to Asia under the Obama administration signaled a newfound desire to engage the region both bilaterally and multilaterally. In addition to strengthening alliances and forging a new security partnerships with countries like Vietnam and Singapore, the pivot reinforced greater multilateral cooperation. So in a foreign policy article penned by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the time, she wrote, quote, "Even as we strengthen these bilateral relationships, we have emphasized the importance of multilateral cooperation, for we believe that addressing complex transnational challenges of the sort now faced by Asia requires a set of institutions capable of mustering collective action. And a more robust and coherent regional architecture in Asia would reinforce the system of roles and responsibilities." Now, it may be tempting to disaggregate Asia's regional architecture into distinct layers, with US-oriented alliances occupying one level, ASEAN-driven regional processes existing at another level, and finally, Chinese-led initiatives comprising yet another level. However, many of these institutions overlap in membership and function. So what's at stake here, and how do we see the future of Asian order and the San Francisco system and the U.S. Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. The San Francisco system has faced criticism from both outside and within. China sees the U.S. bilateral alliance system as an arrangement now directed against balancing and containing China. In the United States, proponents of greater foreign policy restraint believe that the U.S. must also scale back its presence and push allies, including the Philippines, to invest more in its own defense. Progressive groups and populists in various Asian capitals also call for a more independent foreign policy and prefer to hedge between Beijing and Washington. However, underpinned by a strong domestic consensus, U.S. alliances have maintained their flexibility and robustness, even as threat levels have varied across different decades. Since the end of the Cold War, the region has witnessed a web of interconnected institutions and security networks which revolve around the core hub and spoke system, or the San Francisco system, as well as ASEAN and its family of institutions. Bilateral alliances which sit at the core of Asia's regional architecture provide a degree of stability to the region. In conjunction with new strategic partnerships, trilateral relations, and multilateral arrangements such as the Quad, bilateral alliances help address regional governance issues from cybersecurity to public health to climate change. And so this is where we see some of the evolution of these, the Mutual Defense Treaty that expands beyond just defense. This is where broader engagement with regional institutions can serve Philippine and US interests without giving Beijing the impression that its actions in the Indo-Pacific are squarely aimed at containing China. It's in this context of overlapping regional institutions that we must think about the future of the Philippine-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty. As Secretary of Defense Lorenzana asked earlier this morning, does the Mutual Defense Treaty still fit with the current situation in the region? We only have to look at the disputes in the South China Sea to answer that question, but this does not preclude periodic reviews of the Mutual Defense Treaty and making any adjustments if necessary. Moreover, the Mutual Defense Treaty can also be reinforced by pursuing strategic partnerships with other members within the San Francisco system. Strengthened ties between Japan and the Philippines is one such example. I know Professor De Castro has written a great piece on this, and also increased security cooperation with Australia and South Korea might also be beneficial in boosting this intra-alliance network system as well. So I hope that gives a nice overview, and I'm looking forward to seeing remarks of my other panelists focus more deeply on the Mutual Defense Treaty. Thank you, and I'll pass it over back to you, Dr. Willoughby.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It certainly demonstrates to all of us here that there are a lot of nuances that are readily apparent when we look at the alliance from a historical or evolutionary angle. Okay, so thank you for that broad and comprehensive overview. So from here, we now turn to our next speaker, who will discuss the MDT as the legal foundation of the alliance. Professor Renato de Castro is trustee and program convener of the Stratbase ADR Institute. He's also professor at the International Studies Department of De La Salle University. Sir?
Yeah, good morning. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but I promise you, I'll keep within my time frame. So my presentation is based on my article that came out in the Diplomat, looking at the 70 years. And I would emphasize, I will try to be short on this. I will not discuss the entire 70 years, just the key points. Number one, of course, what was mentioned earlier, Secretary Lorenzana calling in December 2018 the need to review the Mutual Defense Treaty. Some of the points he raised that probably it's time to revisit, given that its provisions were, of course, formulated in the early 1950s, that we have to look at possibilities of changing it. And of course, he admitted the fact that the MDT has served its purpose. So probably, you know, given the fact that the relationship has been deep, the historical ties, you have a lot of challenges that have been surmounted. We are in a position as allies and partners to look back and to review that it might be the time. Of course, the review stems from the fact that there is deep-seated concern in the Defense Department, in the armed forces of the Philippines, that the country might be dragged in an unforeseen conflict between, of course, the United States and China. You have to understand the time frame, 2018, the beginning of the U.S.-China strategic competition. So there was really a concern. And Secretary Renato mentioned those concerns: Taiwan, the Senkaku, so forth and so on. So defensive parts moved, of course, driven by uncertainties on what would the United States bring. And of course, what has been I mentioned earlier, the U.S.-China strategic competition. Of course, if we go back in time in the 1950, we have to look back that the MDT was never really intended as the primary bulwark against any possible threat that the country might face, simply because it was seen as a supplementary agreement. It was not even seen as the main agreement of the security. In fact, you have four. At that time, when we talk about the Philippine-U.S. alliance, the description then was it was thick, deep, because you have four. The MDT was only one of them. One of them, of course, was earlier mentioned by Andrew, is of course the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which I believe everybody has forgotten. Now let's go back in time. I'll try to be very short. So what's the historical overview? So Andrew mentioned about the San Francisco Conference and of course the signing of the treaty. The signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty was actually a result of a failure. The original goal then was the Pacific Pact that was proposed by John Foster Dulles, that will call for an integrated system. ANZUS and the Philippine-U.S. alliance was supposed to be part of the Pacific Pact. And this is where, of course, the controversy entered the picture. The United States was calling its four allies to provide and guarantee the security of a former enemy, Japan. Because by 1947, of course, in the light of the long telegram of George Kennan, that the United States would have to rehabilitate its former enemies, West Germany, and of course Japan, which was of course simply unacceptable to countries, especially in the case of the Philippines, that was of course occupied and devastated by the Japanese. So they were being asked to guarantee the security of Japan. Of course, the agreement was torpedoed by Britain, who could not simply see its Pacific dominion being part of an alliance with the Philippines. I think there's two reasons here. Number one, the UK was still thinking in terms of an Anglo-Saxon alliance, which incidentally became, we see AUKUS coming now in the 21st century. And I think there's also an element that Britain did not want to antagonize mainland People's Republic of China, by bringing in the Philippines into a sort of this alliance. So those are two factors why, of course, Britain decided to oppose the idea of a Pacific Pact. So what happened, of course, was you have a separate Australian, the ANZUS, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, separate from the Mutual Defense Treaty of the Philippines. And part of the ambiguity behind the MDT was, of course, the United States was also expecting the Philippines to provide military assistance to American occupation forces in Japan, just in case you have a major insurrection in Japan. So those were one of the nitty-gritties which account for the ambiguity of the Mutual Defense Treaty. The other factor, of course, was the fact that you have the bases here. So the more important agreement then was, of course, the Military Bases Agreement of 1947. I'll just have to jump through. So from 1947 to 1991, the 1947 Mutual Defense, the 1947 Military Bases Agreement was deemed as a central agreement in the overall U.S. security relations, rather than, of course, the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, which I would consider then was a Cinderella agreement. I could still remember the first time I was given a briefing as a researcher in the Foreign Service Institute in December 1986 inside Clark Air Base by the Public Affairs Department of the 13th Air Force. The briefing was all on the Military Base Agreement. There was no mention whatsoever of the Mutual Defense Treaty, primarily because at that time, why look at the paper? The MDT was simply on paper when you have, of course, the basis. The basis was, of course, the clearest indication that the United States would extend it would be able to guarantee its security commitment to the Philippines. But of course, everything changed by, of course, the end of the Cold War. I'll just have to breeze through this. What account for this? Of course, the bases were withdrawn after the Philippine Senate did not concur to the Philippine-American Cooperation Treaty of 1991. The Philippines and the United States decided to maintain the MDT in force. But of course, this is, of course, based on the assumption that there would be no amendment to the MDT. And for the first time, the Mutual Defense Board was convened. The Mutual Defense Board was envisioned by the Bohol and Serrano Treaty of 1955, but was only convened after the basis was gone in November 1992. Although, of course, the two countries are still allies under the MDT, the United States significantly downgraded its security relationship with the Philippines. Of course, this coincided with what happened 2 years later and mischief-free when you have the recognition. At that time, of course, the United States tried to separate its commitment with the MDT with what was happening in the South China Sea, primarily because of the reasoning then, and this was provided by then PACOM Commander Admiral Larson to the United States Congress after the last U.S. Marine left Subic Naval Base in November 1992. How can we guarantee the security of the Philippines if the Philippines has simply deprived us of a base from which American forces could operate to honor the United States treaty commitment under the Mutual Defense Treaty? Of course, this will haunt the Philippines again in the second decade of the 21st century in the light, of course, of the signing of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. But this is something we will be discussing later. Then, of course, you have the China challenge going on. I'll just go directly to some of the issues regarding the MDT. So what have been the tests of the MDT? Of course, number one was the possibility that the Aquino administration could have invoked the Mutual Defense Treaty twice. This was, of course, in June 2011, after, of course, the Aquino administration was shocked by the Reed Bank incident in March. Then, of course, later, during the Scarborough Shoal standoff in 2012, and during this time, of course, the United States had this commitment that they would honor the Mutual Defense Treaty, but they will never, of course, talk about any hypothetical situation. We're willing to honor the treaty, but of course, the United States, as much as possible, skip any discussion of under what situation. And of course, two reasons here was, of course, the fact that the United States does not want to give any blank check to the Philippines. That could, of course, provoke the Philippines in instigating any aggressive action that might, of course, provoke China. So this is the first challenge then. Then, of course, the second challenge was raised by Secretary Lorenzana regarding, of course, the MDT. And of course, you have Secretary Pompeo coming here in March 2019, basically reiterating that the commitment given by then Ambassador Thomas Hubbard during the negotiation of the Visiting Force Agreement in the 1990s. Since the South China Sea is part of the Pacific, and of course the Pacific is covered by the Mutual Defense Treaty, any incident in the South China Sea will trigger mutual defense obligation under Article 4. And I'll just go straight to this is something we have to take into account, the context, that the situation have really changed. Washington's view on the Mutual Defense Treaty has changed in the light, of course, of the U.S.-China strategic competition. This was seen, of course, in the commitment made by the Trump administration and recently, of course, by the Biden administration. Just a few hours after Secretary Antony Blinken was confirmed, his appointment was confirmed by the United States Commission on Appointment, immediately, of course, he reaffirmed the treaty commitment of the United States. And I'll just go straight to the situation, the incident, where of course the United States showed that its view regarding the MDT has changed and it's willing to honor it, even at the point, of course, of the possible use of the military capability. And this, of course, happened in Winston Shoal early this year, when, of course, the United States, you have, of course, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan calling his counterpart in the Philippines, reminding him that we will honor the Mutual Defense Treaty. And of course, the best indication that the United States, the Biden administration, would honor the defense treaty was, of course, when you have the deployment of a carrier battle group, along, of course, with an amphibious assault ship carrying U.S. Marines, the USS Makin Island, during the height, of course, of the Winston Reef incident. Of course, it was a case of hitting two birds with one stone, assuring the Philippines at the same time also reacting to Chinese pressure against Taiwan, which happened almost at the same time. So Winston Reef incident showed that top Biden administration officials working, of course, with the Philippine counterparts would, of course, are willing to honor its treaty commitment under the Mutual Defense Treaty. And of course, the actual show of US naval power. Now I'm in my conclusion. MDT was signed, of course, in 1951 as a supplementary agreement to the 1946 MBA. So it was a case of a Cinderella. But of course, things happened, things changed. With the withdrawal of American forces, suddenly the Mutual Defense Treaty became the sole and the most important agreement in terms of Philippine-U.S. security relations. Never, of course, you still have the MDT being criticized and ambiguous in terms of details on whether or not the United States would come to the assistance of the Philippines. But of course, in the light of the U.S.-China strategic competition, of course, issues raised by Secretary Lorenzana and of course, the recent reaffirmation of the Biden administration during the Winston Shoal incident showed that the United States, of course, is willing to honor its treaty obligation. Just a last point. So where do we go from here? I think that at this point in time, it is, important imperative for the two allies to seek what I call the Goldilocks principle. Not too hot, not too cold. And this could be translated in terms of Washington addressing Manila's valid concern about the ambiguity of its security commitments. But as mentioned earlier, alliance is a two-way street. You always have the element of mutuality. Encouraging its longest treaty allies, the Philippines, to behave responsibly, showing restraint in the face of Chinese aggression and gray zone operation in the South China Sea, and more importantly, showing reliability, building up the capability of the armed forces of the Philippines, and more importantly, pushing for the full implementation of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement of 2017 to show, of course, reliability in the face of Chinese action aggression in the South China Sea. I end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor De Castro, for emphasizing the intricacies of the network of treaties formed in the aftermath of the Second World War. And it's these intricacies and complexities are, they're understandable, considering the time frame in which they were created, but these also engendered a lot of ambiguities. And so our next speaker will speak about how we can remedy a lot of these ambiguities. So Professor J Batumbaka, who is the director of the UP Institute of Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea, will speak about the legal and diplomatic remedies to a lot of these ambiguities. Jay?
Thank you, Charmaine. It's interesting that this panel is turning out to be a history lesson, because I will also dwell on the history of the MDT and the alliance relationship, because that is necessary for us to both understand these ambiguities and realize how they can be resolved. No? Now, let me just begin by saying that despite the alliance being the oldest in the region, it seems to be the most undervalued, underutilized, and unfortunately unstable given our recent experiences. Much of this is evidenced by and do not arise out of the legal and diplomatic ambiguities of the MDT and its implementing agreements, particularly the VFA. Although its foundation, the MDT, has endured for 70 years legally, the substantial implementation and the presumed goal of enabling mutual benefits, mutual security, has not really seen fruition as far as I am concerned. Proof of this is in the fact that the alliance became moribund and relations between the allies actually turned cold between 1992 to 1999 after the termination of the 1947 U.S. Military Bases Agreement. The execution of the 1999 VFA did much to restore some of the alliance relationship somewhat, but for more than 2 decades, the centerpiece of that improvement has always been the Balikatan exercise, which, while it did provide some measure of training and capacity building for the armed forces that would not be otherwise available or probably would not even be funded by the Philippines, even though that benefit was received, it seems that the total anticipated benefits have not really been maximized. The reality is that these exercises for most of those decades since 1999 have focused on operations and expertise in internal security operations meant to develop Philippine capabilities to confront domestic threats and did not contribute significantly to developing a true external defense capability until quite recently. Part of the problem was that the Philippines inherently did not have assets usable for external defense for quite a long time. The Navy had a few aged ships, and the Air Force had helicopters and subsonic training jets ill-suited to air defense. No serious investments were made in these external defense services until the Aquino administration after 2013, which the Duterte administration at least allowed to materialize. The signing of the EDCA under the Aquino administration in 2014 finally appeared to provide a clear direction for the alliance to be oriented to its original goals of enabling the two allies to engage in collective self-defense, and for the Philippines to really develop an external defense capability. But these expectations were dashed when the Duterte administration thereafter put implementation of EDCA on hold. 7 of the 10 years of the EDCA's original term have already passed, yet the two allies have barely gotten started on it. President Duterte's decision to abrogate the VFA, then suspend it, then restore it, further underscored the instability of the alliance. It was essentially a prolonged threat that further put on hold alliance activities. Thus, even the announced resumption of EDCA implementation, decisions could not be made unless there was certainty that there would be a means for the American allies to actually carry out any activities on Philippine soil, which were forestalled by the VFA abrogation threat. Now, both sides have had historically rooted problems in the alliance relationship, which have prevented them from seriously approaching alliance management from a truly broad strategic perspective that reinforces their mutual interests in collective self-defense of the Philippines, not simply as a country, but as a strategic gateway for sea control. These problems are the real source of the much inflated legal and diplomatic ambiguities that are actually clearer indications of Philippine insecurity rather than which in turn undermine the proper conduct of alliance relations. On the Philippine side, the problem is historical short-sightedness, shall we say, that treats the alliance relationship as just another political lever in relations with the United States. This short-sightedness led to the Philippines becoming a free rider on the U.S. security umbrella in the decades since World War II. As early as 1946, when President Rojas, prior to signing the MBA, set out to secure commitments from the U.S. to send a mission to advise the military in organization and training and provide assistance and cooperation to Philippine forces for 5 years, and to turn over 84 ships for the offshore patrol, which is what now has become the Navy, this has already been set. Subsequently, in 1948, after the signing of the MBA, it became clear that the Philippines wanted to develop an oversized military that was beyond its means to support financially, but which it expected the United States to provide for. When the U.S. decided to demobilize the Philippine Scouts in consonance with the policy of not employing foreign citizens in the U.S. military, President Quirino was shocked that some 2,000 soldiers, or not but that many soldiers would become unemployed during an election year, and attempted to oblige the U.S. to supply equipment, weapons, and to absorb the Philippine Scouts into the Philippine Army, into the U.S. Army. And throughout the 1950s and 1960s, as the Cold War heated up, despite its own criticisms, the Philippine government at the same time persistently and repeatedly sought assurances of automatic U.S. retaliation in the event of any imagined communist attack on Philippine soil. These are the origins of the complaints about the interpretation of Article 4 of the MDT, which deal with an armed attack on the Philippine Metropolitan Territory and island territories in the Pacific. And then in the 1970s, the demand centered instead on getting assurances to protect Philippine troops occupying islands in the Calayan Island Group. This one then became the basis for persistent complaints about the interpretation of Article 5 of the MDT. The issue against Article 4, as I mentioned, is the requirement of constitutional processes particularly. Both countries empower only their respective Congress to declare the existence of a state of war. So it was, in a way, short-sightedness on the Philippines to expect automatic declarations of war with every armed encounter that it would be involved in. The absence of a declaration of war, after all, for both countries does not prevent the conduct of military actions and activities for purposes of self-defense, whether individual or collective. So this free rider attitude continues up to the present day whenever we hear government officials in various capacities, right up to the very top, no, bewailing American inaction on Philippine external defense. But we should really ask, why should the United States expend its military forces and personnel on something that the Philippines itself does not wish to spend on, or which its own leaders say are matters over which we are powerless and cannot do anything about? Now, second point, the U.S. military presence in the Philippines has always been the bargaining chip for extracting political concessions. On the eve of independence in 1945, President Osmeña enticed U.S. presence and retention of military bases in the Philippines as a means of ensuring Philippine security. And afterwards, after a new administration under President Rojas took over, he then regarded the military bases in a different light, raising the adverse impacts on local residents and unresolved issues over criminal jurisdiction over U.S. personnel outside of the base's premises. So this became instead a local political problem. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, President Marcos pushed hard against the U.S., using the bases as a bargaining chip in an attempt to squeeze a binding legal commitment out of the United States to protect Philippine forces staking claims to the Calayan Islands, which it had occupied without even formally informing the U.S. until much later, in 1971. They occupied it around 1968-69. This became the basis for persistent demands for an express interpretation of Article 5 of the MDT to cover the Calayan Islands instead of the neutrality professed by the U.S. since the 1930s. Well, the United States eventually compromised by sending assurances in 1976, formalized in 1979 by State Secretary Vance in a letter to Secretary Romulo. That was already mentioned by one of our speakers, wherein they stated that an attack on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific would not have to occur within the metropolitan territory of the Philippines or island territories under its jurisdiction in the Pacific in order to come within the definition of the Pacific area under Article 5. So essentially, an expansive, though unspecific definition or interpretation rather, but which clearly would apply to any attack anywhere, practically anywhere in the world. This commitment had to be reiterated by Secretary Pompeo, but with more specific emphasis in March 2020, when he said that the South China Sea is part of the Pacific, and any attack on any Philippine forces, aircraft, or public vessels in the South China Sea will trigger mutual defense obligations under Article 4 of the Mutual Defense Treaty. And again, as well, repeated twice this year, as already mentioned. So the current administration, has also used the VFA not only in retaliation for a visa cancellation, but also reportedly to extract vaccine shipments from the United States. This is very concerning when the military alliance is made a bargaining chip. Now, nationalist politics, this is the third point, which are nationalist politics which are naturally self-centered, aggravated these trends by using the U.S. military bases and presence of U.S. troops as the principal focus. So U.S. presence came to symbolize everything that was wrong with Philippine sovereignty and foreign policy. And so every administration since World War II has always brought up the issue of criminal jurisdiction over U.S. personnel outside the U.S. bases. This has never been satisfactorily settled because of the political angle rather than the legal angle. And despite incremental concessions made by the United States over the decades, up to the present, this issue is still raised by the current administration, despite it having been rehashed, renegotiated, and agreed upon several times already in the past few decades. The issue of criminal jurisdiction, in this sense, is an issue of perceived diminution of national sovereignty by excluding foreign military personnel from the host state's jurisdiction. As such, it is an issue of domestic governance and not related directly to the issue of external defense. And this now is the source of persistent complaints about criminal jurisdiction over U.S. military personnel. In the beginning, it was about Article 13 of the 1947 Military Bases Agreement, and now it's about Article 5 of the Visiting Forces Agreement. So, the state of the alliance relationship has always been collateral damage in a national debate that frames it mainly as a liability and burden on the United States, covered or dressed in a legal diplomatic cloth, no? But this never really considered whether the alliance could serve any higher purpose than to enable the implementation of U.S. geostrategy in the East Asia. It has never really been considered outwardly and expressly as a means of actively complementing and reinforcing Philippine national security interests. So that's on the Philippine side, but the United States is also without fault. On the U.S. side, the problem has been the absence of deeper planning for a Philippine role in regional security and defense. For decades after World War II, there was no detailed consideration of what role the Philippines could play in a regional security scenario other than to host a swing force at the U.S. bases in Clark and Subic. And so once the bases were gone, even further consideration was probably put in the way out of mind. From the 1950s and into the 1970s, despite the Cold War, there was no serious existential threat to Philippine sovereignty emanating from any external source. The principal threats were actually internal. Initially, the communist movement, first led by Stalinists but put down effectively by the 1950s, only to be replaced by a Maoist movement in the 1970s, and a southern secessionist movement that erupted into violence in Mindanao. Indeed, the U.S. was more concerned about Philippine entrapment over the South China Sea between 1970 and 1975, when the Philippines was actively contracting U.S. companies to drill in the Reed Bank area and sought to secure a clear commitment of protection under Article 5 of the MDT. Since the Philippines did not face any serious external threat, the U.S. agreed with the idea of partitioning and compartmentalizing Philippine internal and external security operations, leaving the Philippines to deal with internal security operations with U.S. support, while the U.S. took on almost exclusively the external defense operations, which in the first place were minimal to start with given the low level of external threat. So complete was this division of labor between the U.S. and Philippines that when the MBA was terminated in 1992, the Philippines was left with only a token external defense capability that shrank even further due to the absence of maintenance and operating funds. This provided the opportunity for covert occupation of mischief reef by China's Fisheries Law Enforcement Command in 1994 to 1995. And now this is raised by critics as an example of U.S. abandonment. In April 2016, however, the U.S. let a squadron of A-10s and then FA-18s linger at Clark to conduct persuasion flights over Scarborough Shoal to deter reclamation activities, which were anticipated due to the mobilization of Chinese dredging ships. Although successful, subsequently in July 2016, as narrated by Secretary Lorenzana in one event, it appears that the U.S. also cautioned strongly the Philippines against over-enthusiasm with the arbitration award. So this is another example of U.S. concern over Philippine entrapment. The absence of an external defense capability also likely contributed, among other factors, to the U.S. to discount the Philippines from any role in any future regional security strategy up until the 2010s, the latter half of the 2010s. Complacency arose from Philippine dependence, and in the late 1980s and early 1990s, confidence over the end of the Cold War put the Philippines even further on the back end of the shelf in U.S. geostrategy. Thus, the rise of China and its extension of its military and strategic interests into the surrounding region has placed the Philippines, the region, and the United States in a reactive mode. And not until China had already occupied its artificial islands in the South China Sea and taken action to present a clear threat to Philippine and U.S. interests this time, not until then was the alliance called upon to seriously consider what needs to be defended and how. Okay, so given this, with neither side having invested in any role for the alliance before, this is prior. Each has been equally responsible for cultivating their respective fears about the other side's motives and commitment to the alliance relationship. Even those in the military establishment here, I've heard some embrace and express the fears of abandonment, of abandonment of the Philippines, with statements like the U.S. will never defend us, or the alliance depends on the U.S. Congress, or there is no automatic retaliation, or the U.S. looks after its own interests only. This line of thinking tends to be corroborated by experience, unfortunately, such as neutrality over the KIG and Sabah claims and non-intervention in the taking of Mischief Reef and Scarborough Shoal. However, such thinking also exhibits a mendicant analysis and posture based on the unrealistic assumption that the U.S. has the burden of looking after and defending Philippine interests first and foremost, without any corresponding prior investment and commitment on the part of the Philippines itself. On the other hand, the U.S. has greatly been concerned about entrapment by the Philippines in its own domestic affairs and being the recipient of Philippine national security problems and actions. This also, unfortunately, is corroborated by statements of dissatisfaction from Philippine officials and experiences in the past, such as the demands for U.S. advanced equipment without corresponding maintenance and operational capabilities and funds, the renegotiation of the U.S. basis agreements in the 1970s, and debates over the renewal of the MBA in the 1990s. Philippine officials blaming U.S. inaction on matters of Philippine defense effectively signal that the Philippines wishes to pass on to the U.S. the burden of its external defense and wants the U.S. to be the one to protect and guarantee its claims to all these other territories. Philippine lack of commitment to alliance relations is most vividly demonstrated in its abandonment of the coalition of the willing immediately upon the kidnapping of one Filipino driver during the war in Iraq in 2006. And today, the fear of entrapment is actively and loudly stoked by the government itself at times. Every time a government official blames the U.S. for not intervening in Mischief Reef and Scarborough Shoal, or every time that the president says that the Philippines cannot do anything or will be annihilated or will be wiped out by missiles in 7 minutes. These all signal to the U.S. that the Philippines will run, not fight, should an armed conflict break out. And every time that the president says that the Philippines will remain neutral in a conflict involving the U.S. is a declaration that the alliance probably does not matter. So all these indicate that Philippine-U.S. alliance has yet to really mature as an institutional instrument of Philippine national policy. The legal and diplomatic ambiguities in the MDT and VFA can be debated to the end of time, and we will always find an absence of resolution unless what is really resolved is this underlying issue of commitment to the alliance. Legal interpretation and diplomatic posturing will not be moderated and consistently tempered unless there are core principles and visions that underlie them in order to support the alliance. So in order to maintain and benefit from an alliance, in a way, let's face it, we need to grow up and seriously understand the Philippines' place in the regional geopolitical landscape and consider its potential role in the shaping of the regional security situation. We must understand the purposes and requirements of maintaining a fruitful and effective military alliance and must insulate it from the vagaries and whimsy of personalistic politics of Philippine leaders. It must make a conscious decision, the Philippines must make a conscious decision to work together with its security partners toward a shared vision of the future based on values, the values that such a vision offers, and to which it must also commit itself to without reservation. Fortunately, there is now an opportunity available. The second AFP modernization program and the 2014 EDCA, implemented concurrently with the MDT, VFA, MLSA, presumably under a renewed understanding, these can form the building blocks for truly reestablishing the Philippine-U.S. military alliance. And I think I can stop there with that point. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jay. Indeed, the alliance, the maintenance, the perpetuation of any alliance really requires a lot of work and regular recommitments and reminders of our shared future, shared values, and all that. Now I am formally opening the floor to our Q&A. We are going to extend for a little bit because there have been a lot of questions that have been raised by our by the members of the audience. And if you can permit me to kind of group some of these questions together because they overlap with each other. The first set of questions that I'd like to raise to our panelists has to do with the parallel arrangements that have been taking place in the last couple of weeks. In the last couple of months, really, and in the last year, the European Union has been very open and very forward to its announcement that it's now focusing on the Indo-Pacific, the United Kingdom's tilt to this region as well. In the same manner that in the last 2 weeks, AUKUS has been very has been in the media. So if I could probably throw the first question to Dr. Kraska, I was wondering how we can make sense of all of these arrangements in the context of the United States free and open Indo-Pacific. if Dr. Kraska is around and if he can take the first cut.
Yeah, can I refer to somebody? I'll come back in a moment, okay?
All right. Perhaps Professor De Castro? What are your thoughts on all of these parallel
Yeah.
arrangements that are
Well,
going on?
those are what I would call the, if you talk about the disease, those are symptoms. There's symptoms of something that's happening. So my take here is, of course, is the major geographic development happening right in our backyard. We have, of course, an emergent power, and that's China. And that emergent power is bent, of course, on pulling its weight around. South China Sea, East China Sea, pressure against India. Then, of course, what happened to Australian products that, of course, pushed Australia to strengthen its ties with Quad, and later, of course, the formation of AXIS. So those creations of those multilateral security associations, strengthening of alliances are all symptomatic of course, what's happening right in our backyard. We have, of course, an emergent power that is bent on unraveling what we call the rules-based international order.
Thank you, sir. And so my next question, maybe Andrew can address this. Based on your studies, like on the history and the evolution of alliances and security cooperation mechanisms, what are some lessons that we can learn from history about previous arrangements like this, so that our mechanisms do not overlap with each other? And how do we make sure that they really complement each other?
Sure. I don't know if there's very many historical examples, because the historical past has always pointed to traditional alliances, balance of power. And I think we're trying to get away from this balance of power dynamic, even though oftentimes these new arrangements, AUKUS being the latest one, are seen as this balance of power game. China and even ASEAN some ASEAN members have expressed concern that it's going to create a security dilemma and an arms race in the region. But I have a slightly different take from Professor De Castro, is that I actually see it as complementary to a rules-based order, because they're still going through institutions and arrangements. Now, the whole brouhaha with France and how that imploded, that's a whole nother question. But I do see the development of these parallel institutions as being something that complements the existing regional order, at least if you're not China. And it's helpful for U.S. allies like the Philippines, or and this directly Australia or the UK, in that it's again, it's not just one country that's involved in this architecture, but there's multiple countries that are in place. And so I'm hoping that actually, if Beijing is looking at this, it sees that its actions are in some way, like in the South China Sea, is self-defeating. And there are questions about the Canadians who've always been sort of in the middle. The whole issue with the two Michaels, now that they're freed, thank goodness. But the Canadians now see, they clearly see China in similar ways that the United States does. And so hopefully, if Beijing gets the picture, there can be a recourse of action from Beijing's front. But I think I'll stop there. And I see Dr. Kraska has joined us, so maybe he has additional insights as well.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, Dr. Kraska.
I'm sorry. I apologize. I have a very large 90-pound dog that demanded some attention. So can you just briefly?
Yes. So my question is, in the wake of all of these other arrangements that have cropped up, the EU is now more open to in its role in the Indo-Pacific with AUKUS. How do we ensure that these arrangements complement instead of compete with each other?
Well, I mean, as far as deconfliction, obviously governments have to work from a whole government approach within each state, and then internationally, bilaterally, and also in multilateral institutions. I think from the U.S. perspective, my view is that there has to develop a combined program within the U.S. government that's a little more forward leaning and a little more integrative. It seems sometimes that it's just the Department of Defense and maybe occasionally with other departments joined by the Department of State, and that it's not necessarily a whole of government effort focused. Even within the Department of Defense, of course, there's competing priorities, not just at the higher end of conflict, potentially with, say, Russia or Iran or North Korea, but with counterterrorism and all of the rest of the global responsibilities. So even with the Department of Defense, I think there is an issue of prioritization. And what I would suggest is that China really ought to be the core focus. Indeed, my view is it should have been for the past 20 years, and it has not been except for the last 3 or 4. So I think that you have to be unmistakable or unapologetic about focusing on what is the greatest issue of our time or the greatest threats, and then galvanize efforts to address them.
Thanks, Dr. Kraska. Now, my next set of questions has to do with the MDT itself, which is at the heart of the alliance. And maybe Jay can also weigh in here. There have been a lot of questions about the revisions that we need to do to the MDT to ensure that it continues to, be effective in confronting the issues of the day. So, in what sense, or in what are the areas that need revisions the most? Is it in terms of, do we prioritize? Is it in terms of modernization? Is it in terms of better maritime security capabilities and so on? What are your thoughts on this?
Yes. Thank you, Charmaine. In the first place, when you read through the MDT, it's already very broadly worded that it can actually encompass so many things, no? And so for me, I don't actually see any necessity in amending the MDT itself. No? For one thing, it's not practical because, given the highly contentious nature of politics now on both sides, I am really concerned that neither side will be able to muster the appropriate numbers for another treaty, given the recent history of rocky relationship between the two sides, no, both between their executives or between their executives and their legislative bodies. No? Second, what would there be to negotiate or to agree upon in another MDT when the current one is already so broadly worded, no, that it will probably end up being the same thing, no, despite a renegotiation. No? Maybe a new formulation, but the substance will probably be the same. Third, with respect to the interpretation issues, as I mentioned, no? When we look at the history of the alliance relationship, the interpretation issues, those arise independently of the wording of the MDT, meaning anyone can interpret it to their side, to favor their argument. And so that's how comprehensive and broad the MDT wording is. It's subject to such differing interpretations. What is needed instead of negotiating a full-blown treaty again, or renegotiating this treaty, I think, is to come up with the appropriate operational guidelines and which contain the actual and practical interpretation of this age-old treaty, similar to what Japan and the U.S. have done, no? Where the implementation of the old MDT between them is updated and modernized through regularly updated understanding of how the treaty will now be implemented and operationalized. So that takes care of all of these so-called legal and diplomatic ambiguities as far as they're concerned, no? And as I mentioned, since legal and diplomatic interpretations arise out of the political situation rather than the legal wording of the document itself, no, that part, no, is better handled by government to commitment to the alliance rather than tinkering with a legal document, no, because in the end, if it's the politics which create the ambiguities, then no new MDT will resolve will prevent any such ambiguities from arising again. No? So that's my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jay. Yeah. So if the treaty, Professor De Castro, sir, you were raising.
Okay. Just a short point. Also supporting Jay. Again, this is mentioned earlier by Andrew. The MDT is part of what we call this consultative system of alliances. So the U.S.-Japan security relation, the ROK U.S. alliance, even of course the ANSUS has the same format. It is a product, of course, of what Andrew mentioned, the San Francisco system of alliances. So that's why it's very general, because it tries to fit in all sizes for the needs of those countries in the 1950s. So what Japan and of course South Korea has done is, of course, like in the case of Japan, they have the 2+2, which was of course also introduced in the Philippines. Secretary De Losario is very much aware of this, because the 2+2 formula was introduced in 2010 when he was of course the Secretary of Defense. So, and of course in the case of South Korea, they have the combined force. Also, I think Australia has it. So this is where of course the changes, the amendments are made not through the actual text. I don't think the United States would agree that, you know, we amend or change the text. Rather, we have to work on the interpretations. And as Jay mentioned, the text itself are broad enough so we could have, you know, interpretations that would suit the needs of the two allies, of course, also taking into account the historical context. Thank you. I don't know if we can ask our American colleagues if they can add something about the MDT.
Certainly, we can do that. Dr. Kraska, perhaps?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'd say that I think that they are broad enough to cover a range of activities. And, you know, the things that I mentioned, for example, cyber attack or cyber intrusion, I don't know how you exactly capture these. I think it's probably right now at least more effective just to say politically or diplomatically that we value protection of government systems or private corporations, because I'm sure the Philippines is facing what everybody is, which is just relentless cyber attacks, United Front activities, all of these other things. And at the end of the day, I think that, you know, talk doesn't make rice, and therefore you have to actually do things that dissuade your competitor, adversary from what they're doing. And so signing another agreement without further action, I don't think is going to add much practical value.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for those answers. Now, I think I can group another set of questions here. A lot of the arrangements that we currently see in our geopolitical environment is really a reaction to the assertive moves and the rise of China. But a lot of these arrangements are also a reaction a reaction and a response, and a lot of it hinges on the relationship between the United States and China. So I was wondering, and a lot of the participants are also wondering, do you think if the U.S. and China are able to reach some form of agreement in terms of their in terms of their differences, do you think that would also change the geopolitical environment? Any of our speakers can answer this. Professor De Castro, you're shaking your head.
Address it to our American colleagues.
Professor Yo.
Sure. I mean, I'll try to be brief because we could go on forever about U.S.-China relations. In this climate, you know, it's very, very difficult for either side to pull back. You know, the relationship. We keep wondering if it's reached the bottom, and then we see new issues coming up. But you know, the hope still is that there can be areas of convergence or cooperation on transnational problem. So climate change is one that often comes up because neither side can really address this without cooperation, and on narrower issues as well too. We still have this problem in Northeast Asia, that North Korean denuclearization, and certainly the Chinese don't want to see North Koreans further denuclearized because it's destabilizing to them. It's destabilizing for us as well too. And so we're always trying to find points of convergence, but to have a broad understanding or consensus at this moment, I hate to be, I'm an optimistic person, but I hate to be pessimistic on that front. But I do think that we can find narrow points of convergence on specific issues. And so until we see some kind of shift, those are, we have to take these small, we have to search for these small wins in specific issue areas.
Okay, thanks.
I would agree with that. I think it has to be, that you may find some commonality that's very transactional, just like the United States and the Soviet Union did during the Cold War, but there's not going to be a grand bargain. And I'm quite pessimistic that things will get better.
Thanks for that. Professor De Castro, any thoughts on this? No? Jay, anything you'd like to add here?
Yes, I was actually starting to type in an answer to that. No? I think that the short answer is no. I mean, it will not change the overall, because it will not change the overall vision and strategy that the two sides have, of their respective, interests and roles and things they need to do. I mean, how they're going to do it. So those will continue. And the extent of competition, as we've seen between the two, is not just South China Sea. It's not just this area, but global. So an improvement in the relations in this region does not necessarily translate into major changes in, say, how the U.S. will regard the MDT, because of course, because what it wants to do with the MDT is based on a much broader framework and vision, not just what goes on between them here in the region. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Jay. All right, so now that we in the Philippines are moving closer towards the 2022 elections, I was wondering if I could ask the panelists if you think, or what are some of your visions for how the elections will probably change, or how will the elections just be a continuation of things as we know it? Will Philippine foreign policy change, and in what direction? How can we what are your thoughts on the Philippines' relationships with China? But more importantly, I think in the context of the alliance, what are some of the things that the Philippines can bring to the table in light of the upcoming 2022 elections? Anyone? Professor De Castro, please.
Okay, first of all, I think we have to look at the positions of our candidates. First and foremost, we should avoid a defeatist candidate. Somebody who would say, China is too powerful, China is too big, there's no point in challenging China. We have heard that in the last 6 years. We cannot afford another. So we need a leader, a presidential leader, who of course is very much aware of our interests, and our interest is of course in our maritime domain. And of course, Jay, I think will agree with me, you have to protect the maritime domain. This is because this is where the threat would come from. Not in terms of drugs, not in terms of the Communist Party, not in terms of terrorism. The big challenge will be emanating from our maritime domain. So our strategic attention and resources must focus. The next president must be aware. He or she should come out with a national security strategy. That will, of course, prevent us from being a victim of circumstances and being able to plan out how we would have to survive this very interesting period, prepare for it, and of course, more importantly, know our friends and of course, our potential foes, and more importantly, our alliance. And of course, the values that we share with, of course, like-minded countries like the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. So we should anchor our foreign policy again on something that has, of course, been familiar to us before 2016. I end here.
Thanks, sir. Andrew, what are some
Sure.
of the things that can continue or can change?
Sure. I just want to follow from Dr. De Castro, and I absolutely agree. I think the alliance could use a more of a public statement from the Filipino side that reaffirms the value of the alliance through a public document like a national security strategy. I think it's been much harder to do with the current administration because there have been, of course, differences between some of the bureaucracies, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and Duterte's own views on personal views on the alliance. And fortunately, I think in election season, this is purely my speculation. I'm speaking like outside of my expertise, but the United States is still very popular among the Philippine domestic population. If PDP Laban or any of the candidates, I think they're mindful of that as well too. So I'm hoping that they too would say the right things when it comes to foreign policy and the United States, and Duterte's comments at the UN about the ruling for UNCLOS and the laws of the seas. Those were welcome comments that they still see that as valuable. But I would, beyond just campaign rhetoric, I would want to see whichever party or whichever candidate comes to Malacanang to be consistent with those positions. So being more transparent, coming out with a public statement, I think could be helpful. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Andrew. Jay?
Yes. Well, not much to add, no, except that number one, I agree with both our colleagues, no? And second, I think we should emphasize the current China policy, shall we say, the over-accommodating China policy of the Philippines, which is what's undertaken the past 5 years, is not sustainable. Clearly, the Filipino people are against it. All the opinion polls have underscored the fact that they would rather have a different, they would rather have that the president take a different direction on it. No? And clearly, the opinion polls are in favor of strengthening the alliances as well as in order to protect us from the problems that this poses. So I have not heard any of the people who have declared their candidacies say anything about Philippine-U.S. relations or the alliance relationship. No? Whether before they declared it or up to now, I have not really heard anything substantial from them on this. No, I can respect differences in opinion. I can respect those that have clear stands against the alliance, perhaps for various nationalist reasons. But what is important is that there should be a sanguine debate about this, and that when we come up, when the next government formulates its foreign policy on this, it should be based on a clear vision of the future, taking into account all of these differences in opinion, but certainly not this defeatist and we are powerless line that the administration has taken the past few years, which now they want to erase by demonstrating a lot of activities in the West Philippine Sea. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kraska, any last remarks? Your thoughts on the future of the alliance?
Well, I've yet to understand U.S. politics, so I'm not going to venture an opinion on Philippine politics.
All right. There are still a lot of questions, but I'm afraid since we are out of time, we will now thank our panelists for their time, for their expertise. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. This conversation should not stop here. However, it should continue because we are on a mission to ensure that the alliance remains strong. Now, to end our session, our webinar today, to formally close, I am now going to turn the virtual floor over to the chairperson of the Stratbase ADR Institute and the former secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Albert Del Rosario. Sir? Sir, you're on mute po. Still on mute, sir. There.
Better. Thank you. Thank you, Charmaine. And let me begin by asking you to allow me to refer our deep thanks to our participants for today. They include logical order, Dr. Jose Santos, Lang, El Lorenzana, Aba, Ambassador Emmanuel Medu Valdez, Ambassador Jennifer Goff, Dr. James Kraska, Dr. Andrew Yo, Dr. Renato de Castro, Dr. J Batumbaka. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank, in particular, Secretary Lorenzana and Ambassador David Valdez for their invaluable service to our country. Thank them for that. I've been asked to give the closing remarks of today's event. Let me begin by saying that China's continued consolidation of its illegal claims in the South China Sea, as represented by its 9-line map, highlights the importance of strengthening the security in this region among countries which adhere to the rule of law and the preservation of the global commons in our oceans and seas. For the Philippines and the United States, with the departure in 1992 of U.S. military forces from Pacific Naval Base and Clark Air Base in Luzon, the 1951 U.S. Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty, or MDT, became the foundation of the security alliance between the two countries. As stated in the MDT, the purpose of the U.S. and the Philippines in forging the MDT is to, quote, declare publicly and formally their sense of unity and their common determination to defend themselves against external armed attack. In early 1995, barely 3 years after the departure of U.S. military forces from the Philippines, while the MDT was subsisting, China seized mischief-free from the Philippines, which could not send a naval force to resist China's occupation. 2012, and while the MDT was subsisting, China seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines by violating the U.S. brokered deal for a mutual withdrawal from the shoal. These Chinese seizures of Philippine territory and waters happen in the context of the so-called neutral position, where the U.S. does not take sides over sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. With China's relentless expansionism in the 2016 war won by the Philippines under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, it is our humble view that this U.S. position is shifting, which may lead to a more robust implementation of the MDT in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea. On July 13, 2020, U.S. Secretary of State Michael Pompeo declared that the United States is aligning its position on China's maritime claims with the 2016 UNCLOS award, which invalidated China's 9-claim. This year, 2021, and a few months after U.S. President Biden took office, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, through his spokesperson Ned Price, reaffirmed this U.S. commitment. U.S. alignment with the UNCLOS award unequivocally means that the U.S. is siding with the Philippines over its rights in the West Philippine Sea, as upheld by the award. This is backed by the pronouncements of Secretary Pompeo in 2019 and Secretary Blinken in 2021, that the MDT applies in the South China Sea as part of the Pacific, and any armed attack on any Philippine forces, aircraft, or public vessels in the South China Sea will trigger mutual defense obligations under our Mutual Defense Treaty. Based on these pronouncements, the U.S. publicly committed through the MDT that it will back the Philippines in the event of a Chinese armed attack against Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft which are rightfully stationed or transiting in the South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea. U.S. alignment with the UNCLOS award also means that the U.S. is siding with Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, which primarily rely on UNCLOS in defending their maritime rights against China's illegal and historically baseless nine-dash-line claim. Renewed commitments of the U.S. under the MDT are made in the context of the consolidating support of the 2016 UNCLOS award by other countries. Last year, 2020, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia sent notes verbal strongly rejecting China claims in the South China Sea before the United Nations, as these countries have been doing so since China formally introduced its nine-dash line claim to the world. These countries were followed by Indonesia's note verbal on May 26, 2020, which invoked the 2016 award as against China's nine-dash line claim. On July 23, 2020, Australia sent a note verbal to the UN stating, among others, that the Australian government disputes China's claims that it is not bound by the arbitral award, and that the tribunal's decision is final and binding on both parties to the dispute. On September 16, 2020, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany sent a joint note verbal to the UN declaring that China's claims in the South China Sea do not comply with international law and UNCLOS provisions, and that the arbitral award in Philippines versus China case dating to 2012, July 2016 clearly confirms this point. There are recent proposals to review the MDT, including from the Philippine Department of Defense, apparently based on the ambiguity of the text of the MDT. We are of the view that what is important at this time is not so much the text of the MDT as the political will and commitment of the U.S. and the Philippines in enforcing this treaty. Shown by the renewed commitments of the U.S. to the MDT declared in 2019 and 2021, it is the parties' actual political will and commitment that will make the MDT effective and credible, especially in the South China Sea. Commitments of the U.S. and the Philippines to the MDT can be made ironclad if they are anchored on their respective national interests. It's critical that there be a convergence of interests, will, and purpose between the U.S. and the Philippines to make the MDT effective and credible against a third-party aggressor. Moreover, it is important that the parties are able to clearly convey the message of enforcing the MDT to an aggressor like China. Through this, a conflict hopefully becomes preventable through credible deterrence. Thus, we believe that the MDT can be made relevant in the South China Sea without need of formal renegotiation as to its text. The Philippines and the U.S. need to continue their security dialogue to reach a common understanding on how the MDT will be applied in particular situations. Given the consolidating support of the UNCLOS award in the international community, the Philippines should also continue to build security alliances with like-minded countries in addition to the MDT. Our Philippine government should actively build on this support by entering into agreements with countries to implement the award. We should welcome and join joint patrols and freedom of navigation and overflight operations conducted by the United States, United Kingdom, France, Australia, and Japan. And importantly, the Philippines should modernize its Navy, Air Force, and military and develop its own credible defense posture to protect its land and waters from China's incursions. We regret to say that we need to recover from the damages inflicted by the Duterte administration, which mindlessly pursued President Duterte's self-professed love for Chinese President Xi Jinping, treating the 2016 UNCLOS award as a scrap of paper, and in compromising our security alliance with the U.S., as in President Duterte's threat to terminate the visiting forces agreement and implementing agreement with the NPT. As we have said before, no other nation can support us more than we do ourselves. There can be no unity over the right course of action unless we initiate this unity. During this 70th anniversary of the NDT, may we remind ourselves that underlying our security considerations is the basic moral principle of doing what is right for the sake of humanity in this increasingly interconnected. Thank you for your relevant presence.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody. Thank you again to our speakers and to our audience. On behalf of the ADR Institute, thank you so much. And we hope to see you again in future webinars.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.